Hey guys, thanks for joining us for this 116th episode in Season 2 of Good Questions with Cameron Dole. Special guests on this episode include Pulitzer Prize winning author David Zucchino. We'll talk about his book, Wilmington's Lie. We'll also visit with ex-FBI criminal profiler Candice DeLong, has a new podcast, Killer Psyche, available now. We'll visit with author Earl Swift about his new book, Across the Airless Wilds, The Lunar Rover and the Triumph of the Final Moon Landings. And our final guest will be author Martin Keller. We'll talk about his new book, The Space Pen Club. Of course, if you would, please take the time to subscribe, comment, leave some feedback, check out the shop, and of course, share with your friends. Now, what is the worst habit that you've picked up during the pandemic? And no, I'm not talking about working without pants. I mean, that's totally cool and should be normalized. Am I right? Well, according to a recent survey by Value Penguin, 61% of us have picked up unhealthy habits that we're trying to break. They include too much screen time, poor eating habits, and sleeping too much or too little. The good news is that 65% of Americans have also developed a healthy pandemic habit that they plan to continue. These are things like washing your hands more frequently, being better connected with friends and family, staying home when you're sick, and wearing a mask when sick to protect others. Honored to have the chance to visit with my first interview with a Pulitzer Prize winner. We've got David Zucchino to talk about the book, Wilmington's Lie. And first off, David, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. Happy to be with you.
Now tell us, where did Wilmington's Lie, the whole project, first come of inspiration? Where did you first pick up with it?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I went to high school and college in North Carolina and never heard about it. Never heard one thing. I didn't learn about it until 1998 during the centennial of the events. I started reading about it and I was embarrassed, like how can I not know about this important event in American history? And secondly, how could this happen in the United States of America? And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this false narrative had been created and that it had been basically buried. So I wanted to, first of all, correct the historical record, and secondly, bring this important event to the attention of as many readers who cared to read the book, basically.
And David, how surprised are you, or maybe not surprised at all, by the feedback that you've been getting of folks that were so surprised that this is out there that, like you mentioned, history books don't talk about it?
No, I wasn't surprised at all since I didn't know about it. And I talk to book groups, I do book talks, and I go to universities, and invariably most people in the audience had never heard of it before the book. So I'm not surprised, because this story was deliberately buried by the inheritors of the white supremacists who carried it out. The people who carried it out were very proud of it, boasted about it, and they wrote memoirs and books and articles. But the next generation realized, wow, this doesn't look so good. We murdered 60 black people in the streets, or our forefathers did, and we overthrew an elected government. So they created a narrative where there was a black race riot, and unfortunately, the white citizens had to rise up and restore good government. And that's what really happened. And then after that, they decided, let's not even talk about that. So they buried it, and it just disappeared from history.
Now, David, for folks that haven't heard, haven't read or really researched into it, tell our listeners just a little bit about the story, the backstory, if you will, of Wilmington.
Yeah, Wilmington was a unique city in 1898. First of all, it was the only large American southern city that had a majority black population. It was 56%. But more importantly, there were black men in positions of power and authority. 3 of the 10 city councilmen were black. 10 of the 26 policemen were black. There were black magistrates who actually presided over white defendants. There were black postmasters, the superintendent of city streets, the coroner, the jailer, all were black men. There was a thriving black middle class. There was a professional class of doctors and lawyers. And this was more than the white supremacists could bear, because they've been used to dominating and controlling Wilmington and black people since before the Civil War. They survived Reconstruction. And now here's this election that puts black people in positions of power, and they weren't going to stand for it. They created something in the summer of 1898 called the White Supremacy Campaign, their name. They announced to the world that they were going to win the midterm election that November by the ballot or the bullet or both. And they said, we are going to violently, if necessary, overthrow this illegal, quote, Negro rule, Negro domination, this government and illegal government in Wilmington. And they did. They ended up murdering 60 black men in the street and marching on City Hall at gunpoint, forcing the mayor and the council and the police chief and others to step down at gunpoint, and appointed the leaders of the mob to mayor and all these other positions, and then instituted white supremacy as state policy for the next 50 or 60 years, and inspired white supremacists across the South because no one was ever held accountable. And they showed that you could murder, intimidate, beat black voters, and you could overthrow a government and nothing would happen to you.
For you, what was the aha moment as you were researching on this? Was there any particular moment that really sticks out for you?
There were several, but one was the white Northern press. And because this was announced beforehand that there was going to be a, quote, race war, all the Northern newspapers sent their white reporters down. New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Trib, Philadelphia Inquirer, every major paper. It was an enormous story. It was on the front page of the New York Times day after day. I assumed, these being Northern reporters, they would have some empathy, at least, for black citizens, and would at least give a fair accounting when, in fact, when they got to town, they were met at the train station by the white supremacists who gave them cigars and whiskey, arranged for their lodging, and took them around and gave them the white point of view. And so what America heard happened was that there was an attempted black race riot. And unfortunately, the whites might have had to kill a few people to restore order and to restore good government. And that was the story that the white press told, which was completely false. The thing that really stunned me, I couldn't find evidence of one single interview of a black person by any of these correspondents. There were dozens and dozens of them. And of course, they're all white men, but not one of them interviewed a black person. And that's pretty shocking.
So media has been getting it wrong for a while, is what you're trying to tell me here.
You can blame me too.
What do you think we can learn from what happened there in Wilmington and apply that to the situations, the race issues we're dealing with, the political back and forth? How do we apply what history was just now newly learned, if you will?
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, don't believe fake news. I mean, get your own sources of news. I mean, don't believe whether it's the news media or anybody else. Investigate as best you can to learn what really happened. Particularly don't believe politicians when they put their spin on stories. And recognize attempts to disenfranchise people, particularly people of color, and recognize attempts to suppress the vote, which we're still seeing today. Myself, I would say get angry at a system that allows politicians to choose their voters. And this happened under Democrats as well as Republicans, the gerrymandering schemes. I find it astonishing that our country allows politicians to choose their voters and to set the districts, whether they're Republican or Democrat, and find a way to fight against it. I don't know that we'll ever get rid of it, but that, to me, is one of the truly astonishing things about our democracy. But more importantly is the power of disinformation. The big lie told often enough has incredible power, and it can really incite people to violence, as it did in 1898. The white supremacy campaign and their newspaper campaign to depict black people as black peace rapists who were coming to rape your wife and steal your job incited white people to kill black people, and it worked. Today we see on January 6th, I mean, nobody killed anybody. Well, one police officer died, but there was violence. There was not gun violence. But the fact that you could get that many people primed to take violent action and try to storm the center of our government and overthrow our government based on disinformation and a big lie is pretty astonishing, and I'm afraid it's going to happen again.
David, we always talk about how we evolve to match the times. Have we really evolved to be better is the question I ask.
Well, I certainly don't see it. If you can have great throngs of people incited to violence by a demagogue, there were demagogues in 1898, and there was one in January. It's disappointing to me that people don't think for themselves and are willing and embrace incitement and embrace violence and justify vigilantism as patriotism, which is what they did in 1898. They were told that you are fighting for your very way of life. You are fighting for your right to oppress Black people and have Black people serve you. If we keep these Black people in office, you're going to lose that right. And if violence is necessary, it's justified because you're fighting for your way of life. And Trump didn't quite put it that way, but he did say, if you want your country back, you're going to have to go fight for it and go down to the Capitol and do something about it.
David, what do you think it's going to take each and every one of us to make a difference in not only in our lives, but for both of us? I know we're worried about what the generations to come, right?
Yeah. Well, teach history. Teach honest, factual history. You do not have to teach that America is a racist country, because it's not, but there are elements in our past that were definitely racist and policies that were definitely racist. And you need to teach this. I don't care if you call it critical race theory. I don't care. But I'm disturbed by these attempts in Republican legislatures to dictate what is taught and what isn't taught. And that disturbs me. North Carolina, I don't know if it's passed or not. I think it's passed in one of the houses of the legislature that you cannot teach certain things. And one of them would be this story of 1898 that's too unpleasant and it makes white people feel bad.
That's right. And David, if folks want to find more information about the event in Wilmington, obviously the book, which is over my shoulder as well, I want to make sure and let folks know where they can find more information about the book and everything else you're working on as well, sir.
Okay, well, I'm on Facebook, David Zucchino at Twitter. I'm on Instagram. Grove Atlantic, the publisher, has a website with a lot of information about the book. And there's plenty of information online. Just if you want to look up what happened in Wilmington in 1898, there's a lot of historical sites. Or you could just read the book. So
there you go. That's the perfect key into it, right?
There you go.
Well, David, it has again been a privilege to visit with you this morning, sir. I've enjoyed the bit of time I've had with the book. Looking forward to going all the way through the back cover of it as well.
Well, thanks, Cameron. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for having me on. Good luck to you.
Now, if I asked you how much you like your job on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say? 5? Maybe less? And even if you love your job, it probably doesn't live up to the idealized version you expected beforehand. There's a list of jobs that's going viral because they sound like they'd be cool, but people who work those jobs say that they're not what you'd expect. Here are a few highlights. Number 1, video game developer and anything in film. You're overworked and underpaid, and you don't get any credit unless you're one of the few big shots. Number 2, veterinarian. Now you think it's caring for cute animals, but it's stressed owners, soul-sucking treatment decisions, and sick and dying creatures all day long. Number 3, nursing, especially an ER nurse. You're caring for people, but the level of horror, negativity, and mental exhaustion is underappreciated. Number 4, flight attendant. It was glamorized in the past and there are perks, but you basically are a server who cleans toilets and sometimes gets verbally abused. Number 5, chef. Like a lot of gigs, your passion can get weighed down by the very long hours and needing to rely on people who are not as passionate about their jobs. Number 6, seafaring. Now it's a lot of long voyages with virtually no internet, no doctors, bad weather, and you're away from family and friends. And number 7, teaching. You can make an impact, but there's also parents to deal with, along with low pay, lack of resources, a lot of after-hours work, and the fact that no matter how hard you try, some kids or teens just won't care. Ex-FBI criminal profiler, man, scary enough already, right? Candice DeLong, we're going to also be visiting about a new podcast, Killer Psyche. And first off, Candice, really appreciate you taking some time to be on the show.
Oh, happy to be here.
Now, Candice, where did the interest in crime and in investigation and all that, when did that first spark an interest in your life?
Many, many years ago. My first career, I was a psychiatric nurse. and I worked in maximum security. And every now and then, although I was at a private hospital, Northwestern University, every now and then we would have a patient admitted to the unit who had been arrested for murder, and they were on the unit for 30 days of observation and treatment. And a lot of the nurses shied away from them. They were frightening. A 15-year-old boy that killed his mother comes to mind. And I can't explain why, was drawn to work with them as a nurse therapist because I was curious. And I thought, I came to see over the years, I really thought the more I knew about people that do horrible things, the better I'd be able to handle it if I ever was confronted with someone like that. And then after about 10 years, I was head nurse at the Institute of Psychiatry at Northwestern, and the FBI recruited me. And I became an agent, and 4 years later, I was trained in profiling by the Behavioral Science Unit, and that's kind of how it all happened. It all started when I was a psych nurse.
And Candice, how much has the game changed since you first came in profiling to all the methods that folks are able to use today?
Well, the longer we exist, the more we learn. I was trained by the men that founded the now famous Behavioral Science Unit. I don't even think it's called that anymore. But it was featured in the movie Silence of the Lambs. Mm-hmm. And I was trained by those men, and they, like me, they were FBI agents, but had an intense interest in certain kinds of criminals, and they started got a grant from the Department of Justice to interview these people. There was an advertising expression in the 50s, if you want to know about a Cadillac, ask the man that owns one. Mm-hmm. Well, they applied that thought to people at the time were called compulsive killers. Now we call them serial killers. But we want to learn about them, all about them. What were their childhoods like? How did they pick their victims? What did they do after the crime? So they went all over the country to various prisons interviewing these people, almost all of them men, 40 of them, and learned a lot. And what profiling is, it's crime scene analysis, analyzing a crime scene and the autopsy, figuring out what happened to the victim, looking for clues as to the motivation of the crime. Why did this crime happen? Was this a crime of jealousy or revenge or those kind of money? What was the reason? And knowing the motivation can help point the investigation toward the person type of person that likely committed the crime. So the police aren't wasting their time looking at someone that very likely did not commit the crime.
There you go. Now, we mentioned the podcast, Killer Psyche. And for you, Candice, what's the biggest challenge in all the information, bringing it down into podcast form, if you will?
It's interesting. You should ask that. We have 5 episodes now available. We spend about 3 hours recording, and that boils down to a 35 to 40 minutes of material for the podcast. So it's a lot in there and a lot of editing.
and you've got to be thankful to have good editors, right?
It is. Yes. If it were up to me, I wouldn't edit anything out. Leave it all in. But that would be a 3-hour podcast, and who wants that, right?
What it's been like to get the feedback from the podcast, and how did that measure up to the expectations you had coming in, if you will?
Oh my gosh. We launched July 13th with 2 episodes, the Unabomb, a case I worked on extensively, and Dr. Death has been in the news lately, a neurosurgeon in Texas that was killing people in the operating room on purpose. And the next day we were number 5 on Apple. They're out of 2 million podcasts. I couldn't believe it. And then we moved up to number 4. So we're doing very well. And the true crime podcasts do very well. And Killer Psyche is different than any other podcast because I have expertise in the field of clinical psychiatry and profiling. And so I mean, the crimes are interesting. The facts are there. We explain the facts. But then I explain, okay, why did this happen? What was the guy thinking? And that's what makes this podcast different.
That's right. Again, it is called Killer Psyche. And Candice, I want to make sure and let our listeners know where to find more info, not only on the podcast, but everything you've got going social media wise as well.
For the social media, let's start with the podcast. It's distributed, the platform Wondery.com, and there's a Wondery Plus. You can get the show advertising free and a week early, and or anywhere you get your podcast, Apple, Amazon, and what was the other question you asked me?
Social media.
Oh yeah, sorry. There is. We're working on a platform just for the show Killer Psyche, but right now my social media is Crime Time with Candice DeLong on Facebook, as well as Instagram and Twitter.
All right. Well, again, check out the podcast Killer Psyche. Again, criminal profiler Candice DeLong. It has been great to visit with you. I wish you a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Take care, Cameron.
Do you remember those red plastic Pizza Hut cups that they used to have? Well, they must have realized we'll open our wallets for nostalgia because they just started selling them in 4-packs. They hit PizzaHutShop.com yesterday for $10 and immediately sold out. But you can sign up for email alerts to find out when they have more. Now, some people might not get their full nostalgia fix though, because depending on your age and where you lived, they might not be the cups you're thinking of. They did have 2 versions. One with textured ridges on the outside and one that was more flat. And the one they're selling is the flatter version. Got a book to talk about Across Airless Wilds, the lunar rover, the triumph of the final moon landings. We've got Earl Swift with us today. And first off, Earl, I appreciate you taking some time to be on the show.
Cameron, thank you so much for having me.
Now, tell us a little bit about the book and about the information that's shared. Obviously, this is kind of stuff that a lot of folks may not have gotten from some of the history books, right?
Yeah, well, they could have if they had gone looking, but the fact is that all of the later Apollo missions have faded in the shadow cast by the first landing of Apollo 11, and that's unfortunate because the last 3 we sent crewed missions to the moon 6 times that actually landed. The first 3, the astronauts were on foot. The final 3, they drove a folding featherweight aluminum go-kart, the lunar rover. And it's a shame that those latter missions have faded because they really were heads and shoulders above the earlier missions in terms of their ambition and what they were able to accomplish. And so it's been a fun project to dig into what ought to be common knowledge for everybody, and to discover for myself just how remarkable these last 3 largely overlooked Apollo missions were.
Now, when did you first have an interest in space and exploration, the moon and all of that? Where did that first come?
Well, I turned 13 the day that Apollo 15 touched down on the moon, which is 50 years ago this Friday, by the way. And I don't have any recollection to speak of the previous missions, fuzzy snapshots. I was 10 when Apollo 11 landed, and we lived in England at the time, so it was at 4 a.m. or some such. But I do have very clear recollections of Apollo 15, 16, and 17. And partly that's because I was a teenager, and it's also because we had moved to Houston by then, and it was, the space program was inescapable. But it's also because they carried this new transformative piece of gear on those 3 missions, and they drove around the moon in it. These guys had a car, and I just remember being astounded by that, and remain astounded today that they pulled it off. But that changed everything, for me as well as for the program.
Now, what do you think that we are missing from maybe some of the research and the findings that were found in those last missions that maybe folks have not delved into, in your opinion?
Okay, well, just look at the numbers on Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. all of their travels would fit inside a football field with lots of yardage to spare. The farthest either man ever walked from the lunar module was 65 yards.
Wow.
You fast forward 2 years to Apollo 15. Dave Scott, Jim Irwin climb out of their lunar module. They get into a rover. They drive more than 17 miles. They cover an area half the size of Manhattan. They climb hundreds of feet up the side of a mountain the size of Kilimanjaro. They sample geology along the edge of a canyon a mile wide and 1,000 feet deep. They crisscross an undulating plain, rather ominously called the Marsh of Decay, collecting samples along the way, none of which would have been possible had they not had that little folding aluminum car, that go-kart with them. And it, it's easy to dismiss it as a bit of a gimmick. We're the most automotive people on the planet. Of course, we'd send a car to the moon. But the fact is, it was a spacecraft on wheels that changed everything about Apollo, to the extent that you can view those last 3 missions as the fulfillment not only of the entire Apollo program, but of the entire U.S. space program, going all the way back to Alan Shepard's first flight in a Mercury capsule in 1961. Everything led up to those last 3 missions. They were. That's where we got good at it.
What was it, as you were doing the research, how long was the research for the book? And then what was maybe one of those light bulb moments you had that you were like, wow?
Well, I spent a couple of years talking to veterans of the program and digging through paper. And God love NASA. They didn't throw away a single piece of paper throughout the 1960s. So it's waiting there if you're willing to go excavating through the National Archives for it. And luckily found, I think that the big light bulb moment for me was just coming to understand that this was an idea that went way back. That the idea that astronauts would need a way to get around beyond just walking dates back to 1952. And actually, if you look at science fiction, it dates back to before the Wright brothers flew, right? Way at the beginning, 1901. And that was a surprise to me, because I assumed that it was a product of the 1960s. And indeed it was. It was actually built and designed, tested, in 1969, 70, and 71. But the thinking behind it goes way back and goes through a lot of permutations and involved a lot of people. And that was pretty exciting to find.
Now, the book Across Airless Wilds, tell us what it's like to have a book out in these times and how much different marketing looks like for you this time around.
Well, it's needless to say, it involves very little in the way of touring to support it. The touring is all electronic pretty much. But that's kind of the way the industry's been going anyway. It just kind of sped the inevitable along a bit, I think. It's an exciting time to have a book out. I've found that there seems to be a real appetite for stories of the space program, particularly because we've been going through this kind of rolling series of anniversaries over the last couple of years. And I think that people, when you give them a little taste of what happened in these final missions in particular, they're surprised because they were overlooked at the time. Right. They've been all but forgotten in the years since. But they're also fascinated. They're hungry for more. So it's been fun to talk about.
Again, the book, Across Airless Wilds, the Lunar Rover, and the Triumph of the Final Moon Landings. Earl, I always want to make sure and let folks know where to find not only more about the book, but everything you've got going social media-wise as well, sir. Well,
you can find the book wherever books are sold. It's everywhere. And, I've got a website, earlswift.com. You can find the book there too.
All right. Well, Earl, it has been great to visit with you, sir. I look forward to delving a little deeper in the book myself, and hopefully you have a good rest of your week, sir.
Cameron, thanks so much for having me.
Does your bathing suit happen to have pineapples on it? Well, if so, you might want to get a new one, or maybe you don't. Some woman on TikTok bought a bikini with little pineapple designs. She also got pineapple swim trunks for her husband because she thought it would be cute to match on vacation. And they didn't get why several people were being so nice to them. Then she found out that pineapples on your swimsuit means you're a swinger who's looking to hook up. Now, it also applies to shirts, pants, and any other clothing with pineapple designs, especially if you're on vacation or on a cruise. And now you know. Excited to talk about the book, The Space Pen Club. Martin Keller with us today. And first off, Martin, appreciate you taking some time to discuss the book and so much more as well.
Happy to be here, Cameron. How are you guys doing?
Doing well, as well as you can be in the summer of 100 degrees. I mean, that's Southwest Oklahoma.
It's about that hot here in Minnesota today, too.
Where did your fascination with UFOs, extraterrestrials, other beings, if you will, where did that interest first come for you?
Well, I've had a lifelong interest in this subject, and it started in high school when I had 2 UFO sightings. The one with 3 other friends outside of our high school gymnasium in the middle of a cold Minnesota winter. Our high school was right on the edge of the prairie at that point, and we saw a large white object hovering about a quarter of a mile out in the distance. And it was there for quite a while. And it was also the same week where a lot of UFO sightings had been reported in the western part of the state by newspapers and television and radio. And then the second one was earlier in the week with just another friend of mine, my best friend since we were 5. He's now my attorney today. His name is Jim. He's in the book a few times. He also has a couple of different monikers, JR and Zod. So a little footnote for readers there, but we encountered a single red orb about the size of a ping pong ball behind his parents' house one night. They lived up against what was called Rocky Butte Park, and this thing came down from the top of the butte, and it engaged us by just kind of hovering in front of us at about 10 feet. And we didn't know what it was. We still don't know what it was. And I had another experience of those little red orbs much later in life in the 90s. And I go into that pretty deep in chapter 3 of the Space Pen Club.
Martin, how much different was reception to you saying what you saw out there? I mean, how much has the perception changed for folks that haven't seen it as well?
Well, I think in the last year, and the last couple of years, really, since the first New York Times story broke in 2017, front page of the Times, usually it's front page of the tabloid press at your favorite grocery super checkout. So, but in the last 2 years, with the announcement of this government report that came out the end of June, the media perception on this as a real topic has it's been a tsunami. It's been a massive sea change, and I think the average person that doesn't give a hoot about this or hasn't thought about it or never had a sighting, I think those people now know, like, oh, well, maybe crazy Uncle Joe wasn't so crazy after all. And all those books on his shelf, maybe we should read one or two.
Now, for you, the interest at a younger age, was that something that you immediately knew after school that you wanted to continue chasing that and learning more, if you will?
Not really. I was kind of a space geek as a kid. I wrote to NASA and asked them for information on the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. I got autographed pictures of the astronauts from all those programs back from them, along with materials talking about each mission. I got up at 4:30 in the morning to watch launches with my mother, who indulged my passion for this. So I've always been interested in space. But the older I got, I didn't think about this topic for 20 years until the 90s, when some very strange things started happening in my house. I guess I'd have to put them in the realm of the paranormal bucket right now, because I don't know if it was, in fact, ET related, but there were certainly a lot of details that would point to that. But I've subsequently became interested in inner space, consciousness, mind, and I think there's a heavy correlation between consciousness and the whole UFO discussion, and I get into that pretty deep into the book too. But I pasted a couple of the photos of the astronauts that I met, including Ed Mitchell from the Apollo program, in the book. And there's an autographed photo of John Glenn, who apparently was very interested in the UFO subject, but was never very public about it till late in his life. And he talked it over with Senator Harry Reid, who was responsible for funding the $22 million study in 2012, which is what the Time story was about in 2017. Only took 5 years to make it into the news cycle. But long answer, yeah, I've always been interested in outer and inner space, if you will.
Now, how has getting ready to write the book and getting feedback and interviews through others, I mean, how has maybe that caused an evolution in your thinking process on the way these correlate, like you mentioned a minute ago?
I read a lot of books about UFOs, especially when the high strangeness episode started in my house. I also had a series of dreams in the winter of 92 that were very involved. A couple of them were lucid dreams. One was a precognitive dream that I later was in the setting for. I'm standing in Boston in the harbor, and I went, hey, wait a minute, this is the same scenery I saw 6 weeks ago sound asleep in Minnesota. That's also detailed pretty heavily in the first chapter of the book. It's interesting, though, because I came at the subject in the early 90s as a freelance journalist. A friend approached me and said, this guy named Dr. Stephen Greer is doing some really interesting UFO research, and he's looking for somebody to write about him and his organization, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, otherwise known as CSETI. And I went, yeah, I'd be interested in that. I had a huge passion for this subject 20 years ago, and this might be interesting to explore. And it certainly was. I ended up becoming Greer's publicist for about 5 or 6 years, and we had some pretty amazing adventures that are recollected in the book.
Now, how was that experience? How did that maybe change in your process as well?
Well, Greer's whole thing is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, CE5s, and that's human-initiated contact using a set of protocols he had developed in 3 modalities: audio and light beacons, and then a remote viewing process, which he calls coherent thought sequencing, which tries to engage, these objects at a distance to come to the location where these working groups are established. And he subsequently set these up all over the country and in England. I think there's some in Japan. He's got a pretty big following. He's also a very controversial figure, somewhat polarizing. He was a pariah when I met him, though, and I think he still is now. But the thing that struck me about his approach and the whole Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind discussion was like, hey, this might be the next step in ufology. And that's pretty much where I landed when I decided I'm going to write about these experiences I had and about what I know about this subject.
You mentioned the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. I mean, we're mostly thinking of the third kind. Explain where we go to the fifth, how we arrive at the fifth for our listeners.
Everyone's familiar generally with a CE3, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, thanks to the Spielberg movie of whatever year that was. It seems like ancient history now, but it's a classic, and that's observation of humanoids in a spacecraft or a UFO. The fourth kind is interaction with whoever these occupants are. And the fifth kind really is putting it back on humans, saying, we don't need the government to make contact. We don't need, very expensive programs from SETI or NASA or clandestine programs for that matter, to reach out. We're going to take it upon ourselves to do this. And that's one of the whole underlying premises of the CE5 initiative, which initially I found fascinating, and also it made me think, like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. but I try to keep an open mind. I kept an open mind through the whole experience, and you can kind of hear me arguing with myself about what I call this radical reality that I faced through that period.
Martin, you talked about trying to keep an open mind as well, and how hard is that? I mean, we've all been trained and shown what is true out there. I mean, how hard is it to truly keep an open mind whenever you're seeing stuff that nobody's ever told you about before?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's the question anyone has that has an experience, either so-called abduction experience, which I get into some pretty deep detail in the book as well in chapter 3, or they have a sighting. I mean, if you don't have any frame of reference for this, you're either number one, going to shrug it off, or number two, in my case, you're going to start thinking, where do I put this experience? I've limited knowledge on this. I always encourage people to do a lot of reading on the subject and try to read the best people in the field, because there's so much garbage on this. I mean, you can turn on your streaming service almost any night and find a bad UFO movie or documentary. There's just so much. It's a fire hose. And since this report came out this spring, there's the run up to it has just been phenomenal. Now people are overwhelmed with, well, I guess it's real, but what's next?
Now, Martin, for you, what is the overwhelming response that the main response that you're getting from the readers and the followers as well?
I think the response has been very positive. The Amazon reviews are all trending 4 to 5 stars. I'm getting personal feedback from friends and the occasional strangers going, man, that's a hell of a read. It's fascinating, which I'm happy to hear, because I've lost all perspective on the book. It took me about 10 years to write it. And I got very lucky with the timing of its release with this report, because, it's on everybody's radar. It's in everybody's consciousness. So it's been very good. And probably the icing on the cake is Dan Aykroyd from Saturday Night Live and all those terrific comedies he's been involved in, Blues Brothers and Ghostbusters, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote a rousing endorsement for the book, which you can read online at thespacepenclub.com. That's the book's website, and it's on the cover of the book, and it's on the inside of the book. He, Danny's been had a lifelong interest in all things saucerological,
right,
and paranormal. He's produced several paranormal television shows in his time, but he really liked the manuscript, and he was very generous and kind with his words to endorse it.
What does that mean to you on a personal level to see someone like Dan, who has such a great following, obviously, but also has that interest in that field, for him to really back you? I mean, what's that mean for you personally?
Well, it affirms that all of my hard work wasn't in vain, number one. Number two, I mean, you can't really get that from a celebrity of that ilk. I'm sure people are coming at him all the time to endorse books they've written or projects they want him to get involved with. So it was a great compliment, and I'm completely thankful for it. Still a little bit disbelieving of it till I see it on the cover of the book every day.
What was your original feeling whenever you finally saw this in book form? I mean, after the 10 years, I mean, were you wondering if it was ever going to come to that point for you?
Well, yeah, totally. I mean, I put the book aside for 2 years for different professional and personal reasons. And, but I thought, I've had some really interesting experiences. The whole Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind process with Dr. Greer was pretty fascinating. We ran into debunkers. We met famous astronauts. I gave Greer's lecture one time at an Indian reservation in South Dakota at the first Star Knowledge Conference. where all these heavy duty Native American medicine men shared what they knew about the subject, about the visitors. And, I just, at one point when I finished, I went, well, I don't know if I ever want to see this book again, which I think is a reaction to anybody who's written a book of any size or shape, whether it's a memoir like mine or a novel or whatever. I mean, you lose all perspective on it. I had an editor that did a pretty light pass on it, and he said, man, this is really good. I had no idea. And I went, you're just blowing smoke. Next.
Buddy, now the Space Pen Club, I know you mentioned the website that goes along with it. Where do folks find more information, not only about the Space Pen Club, but everything else, social media-wise, website as well?
Well, there's a million different websites you can find information on. It's like, what are the good ones? And, at some point, I'm not there yet. I'm going to do a blog. I'm blogging once or twice a week now on that spacepenclub.com site, all topics related to the contents in the book. At some point, I'm going to make like a top 10 list and share that with readers and try to ferret out the ones that I think are the best. I'm going to do the same thing with books, films, and maybe TV shows. Probably over the next 6 weeks, you'll see those lists on that blog site. But it's hard to know where to begin with this subject because, like we said earlier, it's so dense. There's so much garbage ufology out there. I might just be another garbage ufologist. I don't know. One thing that Dan Aykroyd said in his recommendation for the book was that, this book reads like a bibliography, because I do cite a lot of the top line, which I hope are top line researchers on this and critical thinkers. So a word to the wise and the buyer.
That's good. Well, again, Martin, the name of the book, The Space Pen Club. It is a nonfiction memoir type. Martin, it has truly been a privilege to have the chance to visit with you today, sir. I appreciate you taking the time out, and I look forward to spending a little bit more time with the book myself.
All right, Cameron, appreciate you dialing in.
Well, thanks again for joining us for this 116th episode in Season 2 of Good Questions with Cameron Dole. If you ever have a comment, question, maybe anything else you'd like to know, hit me up on the contact page at gqwithcam.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at GQWithCam. If you'd like to help out in the funding for this podcast, visit the merchandise store where we've got hoodies, shirts, mugs, tumblers, stickers, and more at gqwithcam.com/shop. If you have a special guest idea, email me gqwithcam@gmail.com. Well, thanks again to our good friend Brandon Allen for coming on and coming up with our theme music. We're going to let him play us out and hope you guys have a great rest of your Wednesday.